In this video, you're going to learn more amazing Sass features, including mixins, operators, and functions. So let's start with mixins. Before diving into an example, let's understand why we would need to use a mixin. So I'm going to add more styling to my website, and then we will dive into an example straight after. So let's suppose that you want the first heading to rotate slightly. So if we look at our HTML file, the first heading is located right there. So it's the first child inside this div, and that div is the first child inside the article. All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select the first div inside the article, and then inside that first div, I'm going to select the first h3 or the first child inside that div. So let's go ahead and do this. So we're going to need another selector instead of this one. So let's select the first div inside the article. So that's going to be div nth child 1. And then inside this div, we're going to select the first h3. So h3 first child. And we're going to use the transform property and rotate our heading by -5 degrees, for example, like this. So if I save, you can see that the first heading has just rotated by 5 degrees anti-clockwise because I used a negative number. If I go for -3, that would be better. Okay, now suppose that you want to accommodate old browsers as well. So the transform property of CSS3 doesn't work in really old browsers, although it does work in modern ones and modern versions. So first of all, let's check the versions where we might have an issue with the transform property. So I'm going to go to caniuse.com. It's a really good website if you want to check the compatibility of different CSS properties with different versions of browsers. So I'm going to look for the transform property. And here we go. That's the 2D transform that we wanted, because the rotate is only 2D. So if we look, for example, at Internet Explorer, you can see that the property is not compatible with versions between 6 and 8. And it starts becoming compatible after version 9. But you need to use a prefix for version 9 and older so that the transform property works. So if I hover on version 9, you can see that the prefix is called ms. You can see it's in yellow. All right. So let's do this. So ms transform like this. So this is for Internet Explorer versions 9 and older. And you can check other browsers. So let's check, for example, Firefox. So before version 3.5, you need to use the prefix mos. So 3.5 and older, we're going to use that prefix. And let's go for another one. So let's check Google Chrome. So versions 4.0 and older, we need to use the WebKit prefix. All right. Now let's close this And let's suppose that you want also the second heading to rotate slightly, but this time we're going to make it rotate by another value. Instead of -3, we're going to go for -5, for example. So first of all, let's select that heading. So we're going to go to the second div and then the first child h3 inside that div. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to change that to 2, and we're still accessing the first child inside the div. So we want to rotate by 5 degrees anti-clockwise. And here we go. That works. Perfect. So as you can see, we had to write multiple lines of CSS for each of these headings, and they all look very similar. Basically, if we had the same angle, we would have just copied pasted the same content between these two headings, right? Well, Sass comes with a really handy feature called mixins. So you can create a mixin and use the same mixin for both the first heading and the second heading. All you need to change between those two mixins is the angle that you use to rotate your elements. So how does a mixin work? Well, I'm going to go to the top of the file and I'm going to create a mixin. And basically what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this piece of code and I'm going to use the mixin directive, which is at mixin like this. And then I'm going to call it something like heading transform. You can call it anything you like. So, and then I'm going to copy paste the content like this inside curly braces. So basically, if you use this mixin like this for both headings, they're going to rotate both by -5 degrees. So let's try this. So to use the mixin, you need to copy that and then go to your elements and then use the include directive, which is at include, followed by your mixin. So let's do this for both the first heading and the second heading. So as you can see, both headings rotated by 5 degrees anti-clockwise. But what we want is that the first heading rotates by -5 and the other by -3. So I'm going to pass an argument right there. I'm going to call it angle. And then I'm going to replace the -5 degrees here using that variable angle. Now I'm going to be able to customize the use of that mixin for my elements by giving them an angle. So the rotation angle of the first heading is going to be -5, for example, and the second one is going to be -3, for instance. Now you can see that the rotation angle is different between the first heading and the second heading. All right. So that's a really good use of mixins. You can use them to avoid having to rewrite all this content, which is really time consuming. Now you can also specify a default value for your angle. So for example, let's say the default value is -5 degrees. So if I don't specify the angle for the first heading, it's still going to rotate by -5 degrees. And if you check the CSS output, you'll see that the first heading has got the transform property with -5 degrees, and the second heading has got it with -3 degrees. Alright, now let's move to something else in Sass, the use of operators. Sass allows you to use operators when setting your difference properties. So for example, if you want to calculate a certain percentage for the width of your buttons, so for example, let's say that I want it to be 300 divided by 800 as a percentage, that is possible, and the output would be something like this. And this is quite convenient because you don't need to do the calculation yourself. So this becomes really handy when you're doing multiple calculations, when you're doing a complex design, for example. All right. You can use other operators. So for example, I can add numbers. Just make sure that you're adding the same units. So the font size of button common should give me 22 pixels, which is right there. You can multiply. And you can see that the font size has just doubled. You can also add strings. So for example, the cursor property can be set to point plus ter, and you can see that it's still working. And the output is pointer, as you can see. Well, in this example, it's pretty simple. You don't really need to do this, but it becomes really handy when you're doing something really complex with variables, etc. Now, if you want to learn more about operators in Sass, you can head to the documentation and you'll find a comprehensive covering of operators that you can use in Sass. And most of them, they're actually very similar to the ones that you use in programming languages like JavaScript. So you can just have a look there and check a few examples. Now let's move to built-in functions in Sass, which will help you do some operations and change some values using some functions which are already created inside Sass. So the main ones we're going to focus on here are color related functions. So these functions, they will allow you to change colors, adjust them, and so many other things. So for example, you can get the RGB values of a certain color. So to get the blue value of a certain color, you just use the function blue, and this will return a number between 0 and 255, which will refer to the blue channel inside the color that you pass to that function. You can do other things like changing a color. So for example, if I pick a color, I can change the red value inside that color or the green value and so on. So let's do an example. So if I go to our color variables, which is inside the utils folder. So color one is that nice yellow. So let's change the green value inside this color. So change color. I'm going to pass the color there, and I'm going to set the green to 100, for example. And let's see what happens to that color. So I'm going to save. So as you can see, nothing has changed. And the reason behind that is because at the moment we are watching this file. So any changes that don't occur inside this file are not really watched. So if I change something inside this file and then save, then the compilation is going to happen again, and you will see the change happening to that color. which is color 1. All right. Now let's change this value to something like 20. Go back to this file, save again. Let's go for something like 200 instead. And try again. Right, that looks better. All right, now let's try another function, which is quite handy, and that's the darken function. So this function will take as an argument a color and the amount that you want to use to darken that color. So the bigger the amount, the darker your color is going to become. Normally, this function is quite convenient when you want to change the states of a button or a link. So when the link is active or when you hover on the link, you may want to use the darken function. So we've got a good example here inside our navigation bar. So the buttons or the navigation has got links with a hover and an active state. So the color of the link is color 1. So when we hover on it, if you check the final website, we want that color to darken a little bit. And then when you click on it and it becomes active, you want it to darken even more. All right. So let's use the darken function for the hover state. So we're going to pass to it the color of the background, and let's darken it by 15%, for example. And when it becomes active, let's darken it by 25%, for instance. So now if I go back to the file we're watching, save again. If I click on a link, or when I hover on it, you can see that nice color. If I click on it, then it becomes darker. All right. Now, if you want, you can go back to the original background color. And here we go. That's dark and that's darker. Perfect. All right, hopefully this gave you a good overview of the Sass language, and you can see how to apply Sass in real-life examples. Again, it's important to note that Sass is more suitable for big projects, especially the ones involving big teams, where you've got newcomers, for example, and it helps you make your CSS styling more structured and easier to write. So the principle you need to watch for when using Sass is the dry principle, which means don't repeat yourself. Basically, you just avoid writing the same content over and over again, using mixins, extends, and all the other features that you learned in Sass. But it's very important to note that sometimes it is a good practice to repeat a few things instead of making things really complex. And there is a concept for that called the KISS concept, which is a concept brought by the American Navy in 1960, and it just means keep it stupid simple. This means that sometimes you may repeat things in Sass or any other language, but you just avoid, by doing that, you avoid going into scenarios where things become over complicated if you want to insist using the dry principle. So again, you just need to use Sass whenever it's convenient, depending on the size and complexity of the projects that you are working on.